Hi everyone, welcome back to another week on the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. And this week we're going to work on this piece behind me. It's a really pretty piece of furniture. It's got some great curves. I look for pieces like this that have these open doors because I can really frame out any kind of design in there that I want. So they're kind of blank slates, and I love working on pieces like this. It's got just the right amount of details with some of these moldings here. My vision for this is going to be a little bit vintage, a little bit old, a little bit of texture, probably a two-tone color finish, and we're going to give it a lot of character. It's got some existing damage to the finish, and so we're going to take care of that, no problem. And I think this one is going to be beautiful. I've got a vision in my head. I went ahead and made a vision board for this one to kind of give a direction on where I'm going to go, so I'll share that with you guys. And sometimes that's a great place to get started, is create a vision board. Put together what you think your ideas are, you know, whether it's some colors, a product you want to use, a transfer, some furniture that you like, and give yourself that vision to give you some direction. And then you can refer back to that anytime you're questioning what decisions to make. It'll give you a point of reference too. So that's where we're going with this. Stick around and let's get started. Here's where I started on this piece of furniture. It has great lines and great details. Overall, it's got some damage to it, but it's in pretty good shape. This is a fairly modern piece. I'm not worried about this one bleeding at all, but I am a little worried about the slick finish, and so I need to take care of that with some primer. One recommendation I have is to always take help where you can get it, and any small business usually ends up being a family business, so my kids are definitely a part of what I do. My sons love to come out and help me prep my furniture, and I'll reward them with a few dollars for doing it, so it works out to be a good deal. Because of that slick finish, I am going to make sure that I prime this one, and I'm using Ives primer. Their primer is a gripping primer and a stain blocking primer in one. In this case, I'm using it for the gripping factor. I did go ahead and lightly scuff sand this piece first, and now I'm putting the white primer over top. In hindsight, I probably would have used a clear primer, would have worked better for the overall finish on this piece because I did some distressing and the white ended up showing through. I just used it as another layer of my paint finish, but I think I would have liked more of the wood showing, and the clear primer probably would have been a better choice. Here's what this piece looked like with the primer laid onto it, and then I went ahead and laid a base coat on, and this is what my base coat looked like. I used some vintage duck egg around the framing of this, but these aren't my actual colors. Because I plan on doing some layers for this one, my base coat is going to be actually the opposite of the finished colors that I want on this piece. With my base coat on, let's go ahead and get the second coat on this one. I'm using salt wash, which is a texture additive. It's a powdered formula, and you mix it into your paint. You can mix in as much or as little as you like to get a textured consistency to your paint. I went ahead and stirred this into my Ives paint. This color is called Ivory, and I'm going to go ahead and stipple it onto my piece. Stippling is just a dabbing motion with your brush. I'm using a natural bristle brush, which has a lot of texture to it. This is just a chip brush. I try not to use my good brushes with texture because it can be pretty rough on your brushes. I'm dabbing this color over my white, and I'm just putting it into some corners and places that I want it to show through when I distress through these layers. This is not going to be a solid coat. This is just going to be another layer of color, and the white will show through underneath this. Using my stippling motion and that thickened paint with my salt wash, I'm just laying on a little bit of extra texture around the outside edges of these doors and drawers. I do plan on using a transfer in the center of the doors and drawers, and I don't want the texture to impede with that look, so I'm going to focus mostly on the outer corners when I'm doing this. I'm going to do the same stippling in a contrasting color around all sides of my piece. So I did the sides, and then I'm going to come up to the top, and where I've got that vintage duck egg on, I mixed in a little bit of river rock, which is a slightly darker blue, to make a darker shade. And I'm applying the salt wash a little differently here. Instead of mixing it into my paint, I put my paint on my piece, add a little bit of that powder over top, and then I stipple it in using my brush so that it's attached into the paint. The reason I'm doing this is because it adds a little bit different texture, and I want all kinds of different texture on this. So I've got some spots where I mixed it into my paint and some spots where I put the dry salt wash into the wet paint, and they're both going to give me some different areas of texture. Now that I've got this textured finish all around my piece, I want to come back and start working on my paint finish, and I am going to add a light blend over the top of this. So the color that I'm using here is called Graphic Slate, and it's this deep, rich gray blue. This is what I'm going to use for shading, and I'm just going to add it around the outside edge of this frame. I'm using my Klingon S50 brush, and then I'm going to come around the inside with that mix of vintage duck egg and river rock that I made, and I'm going to blend it into that Graphic Slate. This is going to be a lightly blended finish. I'm not doing solid coverage. I want some of those colors to peek through underneath. In the center, I'm just going to add a little bit highlight of that color called Ivory, and then I'm going to brush that in so it's a little lighter in the center. At this point, I've fully reversed my paint order. So if you remember, I started out with blue along the trim and white on the doors and drawers, and now my paint finish is reversed. I've got white on the trim and blue on the doors and drawers. And that's because when I distress through, you're going to see that base coat underneath. So I told you that my original coat is going to be the opposite of what I actually want on this piece. So now I'm going to go through and do this lightly blended finish over all the doors and drawers. Anywhere that I want this blue finish to be, it's going to have this light soft color blend. I love doing this and not doing full coverage because it lets some of those white spots peek through from underneath, but it still gives me this soft blended finish. I'm going to tear this finish down, and that's one of the hardest things to do, is work on this really pretty blended finish, and then when I'm done, I'm going to come distress it. But it does end up giving the most beautiful look with all these layers in there. This light blend is also going to serve to frame out the transfer that I plan on using inside all of these framed areas. It ends up kind of showcasing that transfer. If you remember in the beginning, I showed some vision pieces with my vision board. These were kind of inspiration for the look that I'm going for, and it has some sort of scrolling detail on this. I'm going to be using a transfer to duplicate that. So that's what's going to be in the center of these doors and drawers. With all of my blending done over the areas that I wanted on, it's time to come back and start taking this finish apart. So I'm going to distress it. And this is kind of hard to do because you work so hard on this finish, but I'm actually using a carbide scraper and I'm just scraping over the top. It's going to catch all the nubs in the paint that I created using that salt wash, all that texture, and it's going to pull those pieces off and give me some little pits that are going to expose the colors underneath. This ends up looking like a chippy old finish, a look that you might get using milk paint or something similar to that, but I'm doing it using a chalky style paint. The carbide scraper scrapes it down. Even though I started with a really textured finish, this actually ends up being a really smooth finish because I do so much scraping over the top. You can see here where that scraper is just pulling off all those nubs and exposing the blue paint underneath. And I go a little heavier with the scraper around any edges or places that it might get worn more naturally. I want this to look like natural wear and tear on the piece, like it's had layers of paint built up over time that's just started to wear away. It does kind of create a mess of powder, so just be aware of that. I did have to vacuum after this. This might be hard to watch, but remember that beautiful blended finish we did on the fronts of all the doors and drawers? Well, we're going to tear that apart too. So you'll notice when I distress back from the white, it showed some blue underneath, and now where I distress the blue, it's going to show the white underneath. That's why I put those contrasting colors on as my base. I scrape harder on this in all the corners, places again where it might get more natural wear and tear. I can use the handle of the piece anywhere I want to apply more pressure. Again, I'm going to add that transfer in the center of these doors and drawers, so I want to leave those kind of framing it out. And then I also paid attention to areas where it naturally started to take away more of the paint, and I went heavier on those because I want some areas where maybe it shows through to the wood. So I focus on areas that naturally want to distress more, and then I go back and take those back to the wood. This is where in the beginning of the video I mentioned that having not used the white primer might have been better, because in that case I would have been showing through to the wood underneath. Instead, I had to work a little bit harder to get through to the wood because I had to get through that layer of white primer. It does look a little bit streaky at first when I'm going over with the scraper because I do have a curve to these doors and drawers, but I ended up correcting that. I just used a few different types of scraping. So after this carbide scraper, I came back with a flat edge blade, just a regular metal paint scraper, and then I also used a little bit of sanding too to distress in some places. So I've got different types of texture from the different ways I put the salt wash on, and then also different types of distressing from using some different tools. That variation I felt like just made it look a little bit more natural, not so artificial, because I do want this to look like a really old classic piece. So here's where I'm coming back with that metal scraper blade. It's a little bit different than the carbide scraper and just gives me a little bit different type of distressing. It also tended to burnish the paint a little bit, which means it left a little bit of dark marks on it, which I kind of liked because it looked like a little bit of aging. And then you can see here where I'm just kind of going back on those areas where it scraped back a little bit more paint, and I'm focusing on those and taking those back to the raw wood. Once I've got all of this distressing done, I want to age this piece even more, and I plan to do that by adding some glaze over the top. But before I add the glaze, I want to go ahead and protect my paint finish. So I'm going to put on a clear coat. I'm just wiping on my clear coat using a sponge. This is Ives Satin Varnish, and this is going to protect my paint, so when I put that glaze over top, I can wipe the glaze back as much as I want and not have it stain the existing paint underneath. Clear coat is a great idea when you've got your paint finish perfected and you want to play with other finishes over top, but you don't want to damage your paint finish. So this allows me to play with that glaze over top and wipe it back and have as much control as I want while still protecting my paint finish underneath. I let that clear coat dry overnight, and now I'm going to come back with my glaze. I'm just going to brush on this dark antiquing glaze over the top, and it's going to sink into all those pits that I created with that carbide scraper. I want to really accentuate those and make it look like an aged finish. When I'm brushing on this glaze, I make sure that I dig it into all those little pits and crevices. I don't want to miss any and have any spots of this gleaming white showing through. You'll really notice it if you don't get it down into all the deep crevices. It looks a little scary at first because I'm really covering this white paint quite a bit, but once I wipe it back, it's going to really make sense. I do work in small areas at a time, so I'm only doing about half of this top at a time, and that's because I don't want the glaze to start setting up before I'm able to wipe it back. Once I've got full coverage over the entire top, it's in all those pits and crevices, I came back with a rag and just wiped it away. I'm not going to use a wet wipe this time because I want to leave some of that glaze on the surface. I did the same glazing over all my doors and drawers, and once that's dry, I'm coming back and I'm going to go ahead and start adding my transfer. This is the vintage damask transfer from Redesign with Prima, and I really love this design because it's one that cuts up really easily and you can make all kinds of different patterns with it. So I think this is easily going to be one of my favorites. I cut out this small medallion from the transfer, and I'm going to use it as a hardware back. So I'm use the center of my hardware hole to find the center of my transfer. I'm going to rub over the entire piece of the transfer, and I'm going to lift up on this clear backing sheet while I pull it away, rubbing as I go, being careful to pay attention to any areas and make sure they're all being left on my furniture piece and not pulling away with that clear backing sheet. You just want to work slowly as you go. Transfers do take remarkably well to texture, so even though this has a little bit of texture in my finish, that transfer is going to conform to the surface and it looks like a natural part of the finish. Once that transfer is applied, I burnish over the top of it using a dry rag, and this is just going to get out any air bubbles and seat those edges perfectly. Next, I want to add this same transfer to the larger doors, and so I'm going to cut out these larger medallions and create a pattern using those. Once I dry fit the piece and kind of decide on my placement, I roughly found center of my drawer. You could measure this out if you want to make sure you get your placement right. And then I seated my transfer. I'm going to rub over the entire piece with the transfer tool that comes in the package with the transfer, and then start pulling back on that clear backing sheet. I did seal this piece so that I could put the glaze on underneath my transfer. I chose to not glaze over the top of this transfer because this is already kind of a distressed design, and you'll notice it's a really muted contrast with the body of my furniture piece. I didn't want to glaze over the top of it and mute the transfer anymore, so I chose to glaze underneath. Normally, I like to apply my Redesign with Prima transfers on raw paint, but because I did that process before, this one is going over the top of the sealer and the glaze, and it still goes on just perfectly. So just know those are steps in this process that you could alternate depending on what your piece is going to look like. In this case, it has my glaze and clear coat underneath. You could also put the glaze over the top of your transfer though. I really like this type of transfer that can be cut up and conform to any design that I want. And this is one of those. I was able to cut it apart. It mimics the design that I'm looking for on my inspiration piece. And then I can create any design that really suits the size and style of this furniture piece. Now that my glaze is nice and dry, I'm going to come over the top of this with a sanding sponge. And what this is doing is taking back that glaze from some certain areas on the top. It just gives me another layer of contrast to give me this aged finish that I'm after. With my transfer complete, it's time to add some gilding to this piece. So remember, I want it to look like it's ages old, and that would include that it looks like it was gilded a long time ago and it's sort of worn away over time. So I've got some new products here from Redesign with Prima. This includes their gilding glue. What this is a adhesive that you use underneath metal leafing. I'm going to use gold leaf in this case, and I'm just lightly brushing it onto any areas that I want the leafing. I'm not doing full coverage with the glue because I just want the leafing to stick in some spots. And what I'm going to do is brush this on. I'm going to leave it to dry for just a few minutes, and then I'm going to come back once it's tacky and apply my gilding leafing over top. This leafing is also new from Redesign with Prima, and I ended up cutting these sheets in half because I just need them for a skinny area. And then where I needed the full sheets, I left them full. So on the feet, I needed a larger surface area for the gold, so those are full-size sheets. And then for the moldings, those are cut in half. Once I lay that leafing on over the tacky adhesive, I'm just going to use a brush and I'm going to push the leafing into the details on this foot. I can pull off any areas of extra leafing for places that I don't have full coverage and just place those. But I'm going to use that brush to push the leafing into the crevices and brush away any excess. This again is a pretty messy process. I'm going to need to vacuum after this also. Now I want to apply a little bit of my glaze into the details on those feet too. I want to kind of age this gold leafing. It was a little new and shiny for the aged look of this piece. So I'm just brushing on the glaze, making sure to dig it into all the crevices on those feet. And then I'm going to wipe away the excess. And this just sort of gives an aged look to that nice shiny leafing. The other way I'm going to distress this leafing is using a sanding block. So I just came over any areas without leafing on it and I brushed it with the sanding block to take away any excess. This is what it ends up looking like after all the leafing and distressing is on. I also like to pay attention to the inside doors of the piece, and that's because it just gives a nice surprise when you open the doors to see those finished as well. And so I painted the inside of these doors in the graphic slate to kind of pull in that darker color from the body. I just want a little bit of contrast. And so I'm using Wiesel paint in Weather Vane, which is a dark charcoal gray. And I'm just going to stencil over the top. It's going to leave this nice, pretty, elegant stencil that kind of pulls in with the design that I used in the transfer on the fronts. I'm holding my stencil in place using clamps and just using a very, very light amount of paint on my brush. I'm just going to swirl over this stencil, making sure to hold it in place. If your stencil moves while you're stenciling, it can kind of cause your design to smudge. You can also use a spray adhesive on the back of your stencil. In this case, I didn't really need it. When I pull that stencil away, you can see the light contrast and it looks kind of aged, a very pretty finish inside. I finished this one up with 2 coats of clear coat and it is done. Staged with a simple vase of flowers and a ladder next to it. I love how this piece turned out, you guys. I think I like it even better than my original inspiration, which was worth $2,400. Can you believe that? As always, you can find links for everything I used in the description for this video. You can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, and on my website at brushbybrandy.com. If you enjoyed this video, please click that subscribe button for a weekly tutorial here at Brush by Brandy.